I think probably the main reason why it seems evangelicals drift from the gospel today is because the gospel message is not popular in society and culture. Evangelicals are a tiny minority, and we live in a culture which affirms sexual freedom, which affirms homosexuality, which takes the view that everybody ought to be accepted, diversity and tolerance, which rejects the idea of a kind of judgment and sees that as a kind of intolerant. And so therefore, in that kind of culture, many of the doctrines of the gospel will be regarded as unacceptable or intolerant or sort of old-fashioned, but unacceptable. And people who hold those views will find themselves excluded from the academy, they'll be excluded from the media, they might be excluded from public life. So I think for many Christians, it's the social pressure to be accepted that leads them to move from the gospel. They change their message to fit with the society around them. So, for example, an evangelical ministry might have been receiving government funding for some of its social work and social action. But when the government discovers what that evangelical ministry believes, for example, about the wrath of God or about homosexuality, the government might wish to withdraw funding because they say, well, what you're teaching is inconsistent with what we believe about society. So maybe the evangelical is then under pressure to begin to change what they're teaching and what they're doing to enable them to continue to enjoy public support and public funding for what they're doing. So very often it's social pressure and the desire to be acceptable. Sometimes it flows from a fear that if the church teaches the biblical truth, it will simply decline and be small. So evangelicals quite naturally want to reach as many people as they possibly can, and they want to avoid unnecessary barriers to the gospel. So people may start out with good intentions. We don't want to, for example, talk about homosexuality because that will put people off, and we want as many people to come to church and hear the message as we can. But when those people then start coming, and there's then pressure, well, we begin to change those biblical convictions because they're now part of the church, but we haven't confronted the sin issue that was there. So sometimes good intentions can lead to a tragic abandoning of the gospel. So in many cases, I think it is social pressure. Sometimes it might be that evangelicals have taken doctrines and beliefs for granted, and they haven't really properly thought their position through. So somebody who's grown up in a strongly evangelical home might have been brought up always to believe that the Bible was true in the inerrant word of God. But then they perhaps go to seminary or they read something else and they discover other arguments that they've never thought about. And all of their convictions are thrown up in the air because they don't know how to respond to that new sort of information that they might have received. And so that can cause them to begin to drift because they've never really properly thought issues through. And perhaps sometimes it's the evangelicals who have not carefully engaged with the best secular and liberal arguments who are most vulnerable, because they might find that suddenly they're confronted with an argument to which they have no answer. So I would say it's a combination of those two factors are probably the most common in leading evangelicals to drift from the gospel.